This is Teachers Talk Radio, and you are listening live.
Welcome to the Late Late Show with Danny Wally. Tonight we're asking, what makes feedback effective? How can it help students thrive without overloading teachers? And why does feedback sometimes fail to hit the mark? I'm Danny, and joining me is best-selling author Kate Jones to explore the answers and share tips from her new book. Stay tuned for an insightful, fast-paced discussion on feedback that works.
This is Teachers Talk Radio, and you are listening live. Tune in live at ttradio.org, or to join in the conversation, download the Podbean app and search Teachers Talk Radio. Follow the hashtag TTRadio. Tune in, talk it out with Teachers Talk Radio.
Hello everyone and welcome back to the Late Late Show. I'm your host Danny Wally, and I'm thrilled that you've joined us for another deep dive into one of the most critical aspects of teaching and learning. Thank you for listening to me live. Drop a text on the Podbean app and get involved by all means if you want to call in. If you're not listening live, please reach out on social media. I would love to know your thoughts, because tonight we're talking about feedback. Now, feedback, as we know, is a tool that's got the power to transform classrooms, to drive people progress and even reduce teacher workload. But let's be honest, feedback can also be one of the trickiest parts of teaching. How do we make sure it's actionable? How do we balance effective feedback with everything else on our plates? And how do we avoid some of the common pitfalls that can turn feedback into a frustrating experience for both teachers and pupils? Well, to help us explore this question tonight, I am delighted to be joined by Kate Jones. Kate is a best-selling author, experienced teacher, and passionate advocate for evidence-informed education. And her new book, Feedback: Strategies to Support Teacher Workload and Improve Pupil Progress, dives deeply into the ingredients of effective feedback. It offers a wealth of practical, research-backed strategies for classrooms everywhere. Now, Kate, welcome to the show. Are you there?
Hi, Danny. Can you hear me?
I can, and I'm so happy because it did not work this well last time I had a guest. So thank you so much for joining us. I'm so excited to have you here. Now, Kate, I have to admit, I'm a little bit of a secret fan of yours. I came and heard you speak at ResearchEd in Cheshire about 18 months to 2 years ago. And I don't think the book was published at that point, but you were certainly talking about, am I right in thinking, were you just back off maternity leave, or were you on maternity leave?
Yes. So
Yes.
it was just as I was probably still on maternity leave, because my baby was with me at the conference but not there when I was presenting. So yeah, it's really nice to be chatting with you. But yeah, she's gorgeous, my little girl. Yeah, and I wrote the book during maternity leave, which was different. It was a big challenge.
I remember you saying this. So I've got two little boys myself, and I remember being sat at ResearchEd, and I think one of your opening lines was, something funny about the fact you had baby vomit on your shirt or something. And you were saying, like, you're on maternity leave. But I was sitting there thinking, oh my God, how are you on maternity leave writing a book? Like, when I was on maternity leave, we did well if I got dressed. Do you know? And I was looking at you thinking, like, from that moment on, I was like, yeah, this is amazing. This is a woman who knows what she wants.
Well, it was very tough, and the book was published a little bit later than we originally planned, because juggling it all as a mom is not easy, but it's made it even more rewarding that I've still been able to do lots of things and do the writing as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's an achievement anyway, but yeah, to have done it on maternity leave is just fantastic in my eyes. Anyway, let's start talking about the book, because there's so many things that I want to talk to you about tonight. So first of all, though, and I have to ask, what inspired you to write a book about feedback, and why now?
Yeah, that's a really good question, because I couldn't have written a book about feedback a few years ago. And it was something that was missing from lots of my previous books. So I wrote Love to Teach, and it had chapters about how to start your lesson, how to make the learning stick, pastoral. I wrote about retrieval practice, and I didn't dedicate enough time to feedback. And that's because I've been figuring out feedback myself throughout my career. At the start of my career, I worked at a school, a brilliant school, but like most schools at that time, about 2010, there was a feedback policy that the whole school followed. And the research wasn't really that accessible, or it was a bit difficult to understand, lacked clarity. And I just really wasn't sure about the effectiveness of the feedback I was providing. Should there be more feedback, less? Is it making a difference? So I lacked confidence with feedback for a very long time. But then the last school where I was had a history, this was a school and it was primary and secondary all through. And I loved their approach to feedback. So they had whole school feedback principles that had to be consistent at the whole school. So feedback should be helpful, moving learning forwards, obviously, but it should be workload friendly and sustainable, because that's been a big problem, and evidence informed. Now, they're the three principles everyone can get on board with, whether you're teaching early years, year 6, whether it's Key Stage 3, whether it's A level. However, the school also had this recognition for the differences from the different key stages, ages, and subjects, that you can't have a policy that will be identical in English and maths. So actually, we had whole school principles and departmental policies. And I was head of history, so I, along with my team, created the history feedback policy. And I was just given a lot of freedom with that. And I was able to look at the research, to talk to my department about what we want to do, what we know works well, the things we don't want to do. And then we had years of implementing that. And I finally felt confident with feedback. And I felt more assured about the impact that it was having on my students, but also it wasn't something that I dreaded and took up all my evenings and Sundays like it had been previously. And sadly, that's still the case for some people, for some teachers who have these policies where there's an expectation, especially with written feedback, that you must provide written feedback X amount of times, and things aren't taken into consideration, like how often you see your classes, the type of work that you have. So yeah, I think it was the last school I worked at gave me the confidence to do that.
Yeah, I totally, I'm listening to you nodding, because we talk a lot on this show. We've done a couple of episodes about classroom crazes, where we've evaluated some of the things in the past 10 years that were, really popular at the time, and almost every school in the country was driving. But we almost look back now and chuckle really at some of the things that as teachers we've been made to do through the years that now just seem so alien. And actual, marking for me, I would almost put in one of those boxes, because I remember, again, a decade ago, where the policy was exactly what you've referenced, can go wrong sometimes, where it was sit down, every book needs at least a page. I think there was a stamp, and we used to have to fill out all these different boxes on this stamp, and every feedback was individual and the student had to act on it. And like you said, it's such a succubus of time for teachers in a world where teachers are already struggling with workload. And I think teacher well-being is becoming much more of a prevalent issue that we need to be talking about. I got from your, because obviously when I found out you were coming on the show, and I dug out my notes that I made from that research, Ed, and you said on there, actually, and I wrote it down, that on a teacher tap survey, 0% of teachers said that they liked marking. And it's so true, isn't it? Because, but actually they like students making progress. And I'm a history teacher myself, a written based subject, where I think sometimes you do expect a little bit more feedback to be given in those subjects. But it is one of those where the idea of lugging 33 books home and sat reading 33 essays and trawling through them, the dread that it gives me. So thinking about teacher workload, which we know is a huge issue, in your book, you give teachers kind of effective strategies to feed back to students in a positive way without, adding to their workload. Could you just tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, absolutely. And just to go back, you mentioned Teacher Tap, and people, your listeners, if you're not a Teacher Tapper, absolutely get the app, and you can download it for free. And basically, they ask questions to teachers every single day. I think they got about 12,000 users. And the question I showed in that presentation was that they'd asked the same question year on year. What do you love most about being a teacher? And then there was all these options that you could select, and the main one is actually teaching lessons that people picked, but the option was marking students' work. And 5 years of results that I showed every year, 0% of teachers, nobody unsurprisingly selected marking students' work. Had that been perhaps rephrased, when students act on our feedback and make progress and improve, that's amazing. That is so satisfying and
Yeah.
rewarding. But it's the connotations of marking, like you were talking about. And I remember, I really struggled early in my career. I didn't think I was going to last that long. I was a teacher of history and politics, large A-level classes, essay-based subjects. And I remember half term came round and I thought, oh, great, I can catch up on my marking. And that's what I was looking forward to the
Mm.
week after. And that's wrong. Obviously,
Yeah.
that's not,
Yeah.
that's not how it should be. And it is a massive problem. And when we do talk about well-being, and it is now part of the agenda, part of the conversation, and there are lovely, well-intentioned things that schools are doing, but they're not having that impact. So what I mean is, um, cakes in the staff room, no one's going to complain about that. I certainly wouldn't. And biscuits, and that's lovely. And putting on a yoga class. I'm not saying that they are bad things, but if you really want to tackle well-being, then we've got to look at workload. And if we're looking at workload, we've got to look at the day-to-day realities and challenges that teachers face in the classroom and outside with their planning and marking and feedback. So for me, with all of the strategies that I included in the book, I was always thinking about, and that's why the title says workload friendly, but also to help people progress. You obviously want to provide feedback that will help the students, but I just kept asking the question about, in terms of workload, is the juice worth the squeeze? How much time will this take? Is it effective? Is it efficient? What impact will this have? And it is something that leaders, middle leaders, senior leaders, and also classroom teachers themselves need to be very aware of. And there's strategies as well that the last school I mentioned. So this is the British School Al Khabaira in Abu Dhabi, and they did things that were small things that made a big difference. And I'll give you an example. There would be an exam or assessment week where everyone would, I think it was 2 weeks, where these were like mock exams, assessments. And there would be a 2 week window afterwards where the students and the parents were not allowed to ask the teachers for their results. And the reason for that was because obviously, I worked in a school where they did their exams and they'd see me the day after and say, Miss, have you marked my paper yet? What's my score? And
Yeah.
I get that they want to know their results, but I feel that pressure. And also as well, the last school I was at, they also looked at marking when they timetabled the exams. So there was a recognition, okay, English and essay-based subjects, their marking will take longer. So we're going to put those exams at the start. So those teachers do have a little bit longer. But also by having that 2 week window, it did give the teachers sufficient time. It removed the pressure. And I remember I was a history teacher, and there was another there was two of us in the department with year 11, and she would always mark her papers before me. She was like really efficient. She would, and I admired her at the time, but actually, now I look back on that, and she would say things to me like, I got all the papers done, I was up till 2 in the morning. That's not good. Like, she was older than me. She was my line manager. There's not a good role model to, and then making me feel rubbish because I haven't yet marked them. But that expectation of, well, I stayed up till 2 in the morning, so now I can give them their results. And then my students would say, Miss, have you marked our papers? Because the other history class have got their results.
Yeah, totally.
Sorry. So there's all these sorts of things in terms of the workload, about the quantity, the time, the pressure, the understanding of what good feedback is as well, and how at one point the expectation was basically that it should all be written feedback, and that was because you could evidence that. Whereas now we know, for example, if let's say I came to visit your classroom and I was looking at your students' work and I can see a student's made an error, but then later on they're not making the same error. So clearly something's happened there. They've either reflected, they've had a verbal feedback conversation with the teacher. There's no written feedback or stamp, but the evidence is that they're making the progress. They've improved, they've corrected it. And students and parents have grown accustomed to expecting to see, and not all students and parents, but some lengthy written comments. And if they think that, well, why isn't there a written comment? They might think, well, there's an absence of feedback. But we know that's not the case. In terms of feedback policies, how and when should we give, how often should we give feedback? We give feedback every lesson, whether it's whole class, verbal, in pairs, groups, one-on-one, monitoring, walking around the classroom, writing marking codes. We give feedback every single lesson, and recording it, that's another workload issue as well.
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? Because I think actually what teachers have got much better at is asking why. And to me, we've started to ask that question of why is it important that I stamp that book? Because I know I've given feedback. The child knows they've received feedback. So why have I got to stamp the book? I've got to stamp the book so a senior leader knows I've given feedback. And actually, I think we've got better. We're still not there, but we've got better at kind of saying, no, I'm not doing that just so that you've got evidence that I'm doing what I'm supposed to be doing. There's a professional integrity almost that you've got to trust me and my outcomes and what happens in my classroom. But I do agree that I don't think we're entirely there. And I do think you're right in that I think there is an expectation from, some parents that books will go home and they'll be marking an individual feedback. And I mean, one of the things, and I appreciate I'm very much going to be preaching to the Pope here, but when I started to look into this, there's so much research, isn't there? But what's interesting is like a lot of the research actually says that feedback, if it's not done correctly, can be really detrimental. So it can go the other way. And if teachers are giving overly critical feedback, it can hinder motivation. There's other research that suggests that there's other research that suggests that it can actually compromise effectiveness of what you're doing in the classroom if you're not doing it in the right manner. And I just thought that was really interesting, this idea that, here it is, Dylan Wiliam, grade-only feedback can overshadow actionable advice that you're giving to students and therefore reduce motivation. So it's an interesting question, isn't it, really, where we start saying, it's not just whether we do or don't give feedback, it's the type of feedback that we give that I think we need to have that conversation about.
Yeah, and just to go back to Teacher Tapp, like I said, this is research from classroom teachers on the ground, and very recently, 47% of classroom teachers responded that they were expected to use a verbal feedback stamp or write something like verbal feedback given and date. These things are still happening, and I don't mind saying this, my editor at John Catt did actually ask me to tone down my criticism of the verbal feedback stamp, and he's absolutely right, because this is something I regret, that of being a bit harsh and judgy and saying, when we have done these things, because every teacher whatever they do, they're motivated by well-intentioned reasons.
Yeah.
They everything. It's never something that we do. The verbal feedback stamp is either because you're told to by a senior leader and a line manager, or you think, well, this might remind the students, or the parents might like it. So it's really easy to sort of mock things that we now consider to be outdated and
Yeah.
ridiculous and things like that. But then when we have to sort of go back to the why we did it, and like you said, that's why we've stopped doing some of the things, because we ask why. And I'm really glad you mentioned Dylan William. I think he's probably been the biggest influence in terms of feedback. He says there's a brilliant chapter this is another John Catt book. It's 2017, but it's still really good. And it's Carl Hendrick and Robin McPherson. What does this look like in the classroom? And they have different chapters by different contributors. And there's an assessment and feedback chapter with Daisy Christodoulou and Dylan William. I have read so many times, I feel like I could just quote it and the page numbers. It's so brilliant. And that's where Dylan William in that book says the only thing that matters with the feedback is the reaction of the recipient. And that was a big thing that was missing. That when senior leaders or whoever it was, inspectors, were checking for feedback and they were looking how many comments have been written and how often, that's the wrong thing that you're looking at, because that teacher might have written the feedback and it looks great, it's in the right color pen, but if the student ignored it, didn't read it, then it was a waste of time and it did not have the impact. So the students have got to realize this. We need to have a conversation with them and tell them that they are the secret to effective feedback because it depends on what they do with it. If they ignore it, reject it, they're very defensive, then obviously it won't help them with their progress. But if they embrace it, they act on it, or they ask questions if they don't understand and they seek clarification, then they are taking ownership of their learning and they play a huge role in the effectiveness of feedback. And I just think at some point in the past that was maybe forgotten.
Oh, I totally agree, and I think I remember a penny drop moment almost for me where it was that realization that it isn't always about me having to tell the students what they need to do better that will make the difference. Actually, a lot of the literature that I've engaged with talks about how it's more effective for the student to be metacognitively asking themselves what they need to do to improve. So kind of showing them a good example or analysing a model answer together and then them reflecting back on their work, almost like a feed forward task, almost taking on board the feedback or the example that they've been given, but then it's themselves that then almost evaluate their work and see what improvements they need to be made. And I know that in your book you talk about actionable feedback. And is that what you mean by that idea of giving the student something to do in the next task to act upon the feedback?
Yeah, and that's what Dylan William is referred to by saying it's the reaction of the recipient. And I am very guilty in the past of taking my books home, marking them, writing the written comments, putting the stickers in, and then someone hands out the books as I'm taking the register, and I'll say, read the feedback, and then I just move on with the lesson. And there's got to be time provided, but opportunities. What's interesting is DIRT. I don't know if you remember DIRT, Dedicated Improvement Reflection Time. I hate that acronym just because in the classroom, everything had dirt written on it, and the students would make the jokes about dirty time, and I couldn't cope with that. I really didn't like it. But the concept is actionable feedback.
Yeah.
It means dedicating time to reflect, but dedicating time to act on it. And there's lots of examples. Well, all the examples in the book are actionable. So the one from Dylan William that he calls detective strategy, find and fix. This is a really simple feedback technique that a teacher could do in a variety of ways in the lesson. So you're a history teacher, so you might be circling, walking around the class, you look at a student's piece of work and you can see some mistakes in their paragraph. Now you could decide based on your knowledge of the student how much support you give them. So you might just say there's 2 errors in that paragraph. Can you find and fix them? You may feel that that student needs a little bit more support. So you might say, one of your key dates is wrong and you've used one of the key terms in the wrong way. Something like that to give them a bit more support. Or if that's too challenging for some students, then but that should be the starting point, get them to have a look. And if you go back and they have fixed it, you can give them that feedback. If they say, no, I still can't find the error, then you could do something like the dot margin and put a dot in the margin where to show there's a mistake on this line. Or you could underline the error and highlight, well, this is the error, and then they fix it. Some students, you just have to say, I just want you to double check that paragraph for me. And they'll be able to spot it and identify it. Now, sometimes those students won't like that. They'd rather you just say, well, just tell me which one's wrong and tell me what the right answer is. It's quicker for everyone. But we want the students to engage with the feedback. Now, another reason they have to act on that feedback immediately is because of working memory. And there's a lot written about working memory and cognitive science, but we need to remember it in terms of feedback. Because you could have a really good one-on-one feedback conversation with a student, they're nodding along, smiling, thanks, miss. You walk over to somebody else, and then they've made that mistake. And that's because perhaps that conversation was quite lengthy. Perhaps there were several targets, and they thought, oh, I'll come back to that later. But because of the limitations of working memory and how you can't hold on to much information and you can't hold on to it for long, then they've forgotten it. And then that feedback conversation obviously won't have an impact if it's forgotten. So acting on it immediately or as soon as possible is important. Another thing you could do, though, is you could say, write this down in the margin or write it on a post-it note. Write it now, just in case you forget. Now, the other thing about writing it down and the student writing it down is that you can check then that they've actually understood it. Now, when I'm looking at the research, when I'm writing a book, and especially with feedback, I felt really overwhelmed in terms of the research. But I do try to look for any common trends or patterns. And something that really stood out to me was research from individuals like John Hattie and Daisy Christodoulou had written about this, and several others. There's a brilliant book, Thanks for the Feedback. It's also in there. This point was coming across about how people often don't understand the feedback. So if I've just written comments in the books, handed the books out to students, read the comments, and now let's move on, I haven't checked if they've understood. I haven't provided them with an opportunity to ask me some questions. And even if they understand it, they might not understand what they need to do next. And some feedback can be quite vague or generalized, especially if it's things like punctuation, grammar, and they might not know exactly where they're going wrong. So checking for understanding with the feedback is really important, but it can be quite difficult to do. So as I've said, there's just a few ways you can do that. Another actionable task for subjects like English, humanities, is the yellow box method I shared in the conference. And probably people are familiar with this. This is from the George Spencer Academy, and it's a brilliant idea. So where the teacher will read an extended piece of writing or an exam answer, they select part of that to provide written comments and focus feedback. And the way they identify that is with a yellow box or whatever colour you want. Now, the students like this because they don't have to write out the whole 2 pages, the whole story, the whole answer or essay. They write out what's in the yellow box again, but acting on that focused feedback. Something that I've added to the yellow box method is a blue box. Now, the reason I came up with the blue box is because I felt a bit guilty that the students were producing great work, and I was putting a yellow box around the section that they really needed to improve, and not recognising their strengths and the strong parts of the answer or the story. So the blue box for me would be the strongest part. It might be the introduction or something like that. And perhaps you don't have to write feedback on it. You could just have a blue box and ask them to reflect. Why do you think I've selected this as your strongest part of your answer? Or you could give the focus feedback. But the main thing with the yellow box is that it's there and it's actionable, but you've got to make the time for it. If you don't have the time in the lesson, perhaps that's the homework task. But if you don't make time for it, then again, how do you know they're reading the feedback? How do you know they're engaging with it? And
Totally.
what happens is it will give the feedback, and then the next time, perhaps 2 weeks later, they do a similar type of task with different content, they're making the same mistakes. And that's why Dylan Williams says feedback should improve the learner and not the work. Now, great if the work improves, but it's not great if that piece of work is improved, but next week they're then making the same mistake.
Yeah,
Because
totally. Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you up then. I was just thinking while you were
No.
talking. I think you're so right in what you're saying. I think there's such an assumption sometimes, isn't there, that feedback is always somehow after the event, and it's something that you go back to. And that idea, like you say, Dylan Williams says that the feedback is about improving the students. And one of the many things that I've taken from your work was the idea of preemptive feedback, and that has really changed my practice, honestly, particularly with things like literacy errors. So you talked about, and it was a while ago, but you talked about preempting spellings that students might struggle with, and actually making a point of pausing in your lesson, preemptively putting them on the board and saying, look, this is a tricky word to spell, so let's actually look at it together and let's pay attention to it. And again, planning for misconceptions. Doug Lemov talks about, effective planning being actually to plan for the errors that they'll make. And to me now, again, it's that light bulb moment, isn't it, where you look back and you think, yeah, that's a much better way to go about this, is to preempt the errors rather than allow the students to make the errors and then somehow find yourself trying to unpick them.
Yeah, you can always predict it, can't you? And you're a history teacher, teacher is 7, William the Conqueror. That is a difficult word, conqueror, for year 7 to spell. Might not be a word they've encountered before. So it's perfectly understandable that would be challenging, and they may make an error with that. So if we know that's going to be the case, we will perhaps have it big letters on the board, we'll have it in their book, we'll have a glossary, we might even talk through the word and talk about, the origins, the etymology, that type of thing. And we say to the class, other students have made this mistake, but you're not going to make this mistake, because here it is, here's the support, and you remind them to self-check and correct as well. So then your feedback is not this repetitive thing year after year. And what we've got to do is help early career teachers with this, so that they're not going through, oh, I've taught this topic 3 years in a row, I'm now starting to remember what the common mistakes are. So we can help other teachers, and that's why I said about the creation of misconception banks, is having a resource where teachers, and one could be for the teacher, one could be for the student. The teacher misconception bank could be something that individuals contribute, and then perhaps you've got someone new joining the department, either an early career teacher, or perhaps it's not their specialism, or perhaps it is their subject but they haven't taught this unit. So then they've got this bank of misconceptions. Oh, these are the things that often year 9 struggle with, or that this is a common misconception that needs to be challenged and addressed. So that idea of the preemptive feedback, you are doing that work. It's prevention is better than cure, isn't it?
Yeah,
Why try
definitely.
and cure something when we can prevent it happening in the first place? So then your feedback will obviously then focus on something else. And there's lots of ways that you could do that, the preemptive feedback. But a good way obviously is the whole class discussion and sharing resources and just being very open and transparent and talking through things as well. But something I've noticed as a teacher, secondary teacher. This is different in primary. But I've had parents' evenings, and let's say you're the last appointment of the night, and the parents are there with their child, and they come to you, and you say, oh, okay, and you give the feedback, and they roll their eyes, and they say, oh, we're hearing this, we've heard this from all his teachers tonight. And that makes you think, well, we're all saying the same thing. I don't know, as a history teacher, what feedback my students are getting outside of my subject. But especially in terms of literacy, it's very likely to be similar. That's why it's so important the students recognised it's about them improving as a learner. So they may get some feedback in history that is transferable, especially, as I said, if it's, for example, literacy based, and it could be about the use of the correct tense or capital letters, full stop, the use of paragraphs. So if that's something that they haven't been doing, and then now that it's been brought to their attention, they know how to do that, then they should then be able to apply that in other subjects. And that feedback should be having this ripple effect that it doesn't always have.
Definitely. And I think, one of the key messages that I'm taking from everything that you're saying is it's about working smarter, isn't it? It's not teachers working harder, it's teachers working smarter. Right, Kate, I'm going to have to go to a word from our sponsors and the latest news, but please stay on the line. We'll come back after the news and explore the idea of kind of peer and self-assessment and the roles that they can play in meaningful learning. So don't go anywhere, listeners. We'll be back in a minute.
This show is brought to you in partnership with John Catt Educational, publishers of professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Don't miss out. Level up your professional development today and visit johncattbookshop.com to explore the full range of titles. Use the code JCTTR2425 for 20% off your order. Happy reading.
Parentkind are a national charity representing parent views and voice and championing parental participation in education and school life. By fostering strong school-parent partnerships, we can boost student attendance, improve behaviour and enhance academic performance. When parents actively participate, students thrive. Join the movement that's reshaping education for the better. Visit parentkind.org to learn more about reaping the rewards of working in partnership with parents.
Are you ready to enhance your assessments in a world where AI is transforming education? Join Toddle for an exclusive event, Designing Assessments with AI, a live session tailored just for UK educators. Explore practical strategies to keep your assessments both effective and fair as AI continues to reshape education. Hear from experts Darren Coxon and Dale Bassett, who'll guide you through designing authentic assessments and navigating AI's biggest challenges. It's happening on December the 2nd from 4 to 6:30 p.m. Don't miss out on this opportunity to discover how you can adapt your assessment strategies for the future of education. Register for free at toddleapp.com/UKAI and secure your spot now.
Hey educators, ready to kickstart 2025 with world-class inspiration? Then don't miss Bet UK, happening January 22nd to 24th in London. Get fired up in our high-energy arena hosted by Laura McInerney with an incredible lineup. Hear from racing driver and inclusion advocate Nicholas Hamilton and the poetic power duo Michael Rosen and Christian Foley. Plus, don't miss the legendary Stephen Fry discuss the human approach to AI. Explore hundreds of hours of unmissable content, the latest edtech, and free CPD opportunities to supercharge your skills. All for free, so why wait? Head to betshow.com and book your ticket now. Let's make 2025 your best year yet.
This is Teachers Talk Radio, and this is Teachers Talk Radio News.
Schools Week features a report on the disadvantage gap in EYFS. According to new data, the gap is widening between the proportion of pupils eligible for means-tested free school meals achieving a good level of development when compared to their non-disadvantaged peers. The gap grew from 19.9% in 2022 to 23 to 20.5% last year. This reversed the progress logged last year according to the Department for Education data published recently, although the data set only goes back to 2021 to 22 after changes were made to EYFS. The persistence of disadvantage gaps has become a source of consternation across the education sector. The EYFS data shows the gap is opening up among the youngest school pupils. Girls continue to outperform boys, with this gap widening for the second year running, but the difference between autumn and summer-born children narrowed at the same time frame. Full analysis of the data and further information about the disadvantage gap at post-16 A-level studies can be found on the Schools Week website. The BBC covers reports that Australia will ban children aged under 16 from using social media after its Senate approved the world's strictest bans. The ban, which will not take effect for at least 12 months, could see tech companies fined the equivalent of £25.7 million if they don't comply. The Australian Prime Minister says the legislation is needed to protect young people from the harms of social media, something echoed by parents' groups. Critics say questions over how the ban will work and the impact it may have on privacy and social connection have been unanswered. The Australian ban sets the highest age limit by any country and does not include exemptions for existing users or those with parental consent. The votes passed by 34 votes to 19, and full details can be found on the BBC News website. In a linked story, The Independent reports that just 18% of teachers think a phone ban would improve pupil behaviour, according to a recent poll. More than 2 in 5 teachers agree that mobile phones can be a teaching tool within schools. The survey of 1001 UK teachers also suggested that only 20% feel unauthorised mobile phone use disrupts their classroom frequently, whilst the most disruptive behaviours were listed as student chatter, fidgeting and disrespect to other students. The YouGov poll also asked for teaching's top measures for improving behaviour, with the majority suggesting reducing class sizes and increased support for pupils with behavioural challenges. Further details on this aspect of the issue of mobile technology can be found on the newspaper's website. Schools Week also reports on an aspect of the recruitment issue. A report on head teacher recruitment says schools in the North West are the most likely to be isolated and shut out from attracting the best head teachers. The Education Policy Institute found current and future head teachers tend to work only in connected communities and were unlikely to move for work outside of those areas. This creates isolated schools left without the best head teachers. The North West had the largest proportion of isolated primary schools, whilst isolated secondary schools were concentrated in the West Midlands, the East of England and the South East. London attracts more than half of the most effective primary leaders. The North East is also revealed as disproportionately successful in developing and attracting highly effective head teachers, despite having a smaller share of the overall teacher workforce. It attracts the highest proportion of the most effective secondary school heads at 23%, and also trains 1/5 of the EPI ranked head teachers on whether they improved their school's test or exam results, and then checked how schools were led in terms of other metrics such as pupil progress, teacher retention and school attendance. A researcher for the EPI said the research showed government needs to encourage more localised movement across schools, and Academy Trust should consider how they grow and deploy leaders in order to spread best practice. Finally, the BBC features a report on a 49-year-old exercise book. The book, discovered in a drawer of a school desk in Cornwall, has been returned to its former owner after it was discovered over half-term. The front cover of the book was shared on social media, and the owner was invited back to the school to be reunited with his property. The book was labelled Roman Studies and contained detailed sketches of an amphitheatre, Roman bathing systems and cities. The presentation of the book was exceptional, and the teacher who discovered it felt it deserved to be returned to its former owner. When the owner was asked what he might do with the book, he replied, "I was thinking of putting it in a drawer somewhere." This has been your Teachers Talk Radio News with Jo Fox.
Okay, welcome back, everybody. Thank you so much for joining. This is the Late Late Show with Danny Wally, and we have got the amazing privilege tonight of talking to Kate Jones about feedback. Welcome back, Kate. Thank you for sticking with us.
Yeah, thank you.
We've talked tonight so much, so much, and so much amazing, and I think really valuable kind of comments really and strategies that you've talked for teachers to make sure that feedback is effective within their classrooms. One of the areas that I'm aware that we haven't touched on yet is peer and self-assessment. And I think, you know, they're two tricky aspects really of feedback, because I personally think that there is a real role for them in improving student progress and in learning. But I think particularly with peer assessment or peer feedback, we need to be really careful really about how we approach that. What would your advice or suggestions be about using peer and self-assessment feedback within a classroom?
Yeah, I wrote a chapter for self and peer assessment, and I am a huge advocate for these strategies. But from experience, I'm well aware that peer assessment can be disastrous, and that's can be off-putting. Some people might not want to use peer assessment. However, we've got to remember the students are novices when it comes to giving feedback. So look at how we struggle as teachers to know what effective feedback is, and we're engaging with the research and we're reflecting. So to say, pass your book to someone while they mark in a purple green pen and they'll give feedback, they've got to have guidance. They've got to be coached. They need to see examples with modelling. But when you do that, it's absolutely worth it. And it does pay off. Although I used to be a host on Teachers Talk Radio, and I interviewed Dylan William, and yeah,
Wow!
that's probably in the back catalogue somewhere
Oh
in the
my God,
archives.
that's like a claim to fame, that. I'm enjoying that.
Yeah, he's my Welsh hero, and he worked with him on the formative assessment book and wrote a few articles with him. But I remember asking him about peer assessment, and he was really good when he was saying, well, actually, the teacher is the expert in the room. So it is understandable why the students want your feedback over perhaps the person sat next to them. Although some students do like feedback from their peers. So the way to get this right is obviously through a lot of coaching, support, and guidance. Another thing I would say is try and have immediate impact with peer assessment. So if you're writing an extended piece of writing that you usually peer assess at the end and you swap books and so on, do it differently and peer assess after each paragraph. So they wrote their first paragraph. Now they'll also need often resources to help them, because what we've seen is students saying, oh, this is a mistake, you've spelt something wrong, and actually they've got it wrong, not the student's work that they're looking at. So they should have a success criteria, a mark scheme, a spelling mat, glossary, knowledge organizer, something to give them a bit of help with marking. And if they mark that first paragraph and they've identified an error and they've identified a mistake, then their partner can act on that immediately in the next paragraph by correcting it and not making that mistake again. And by having that immediate impact, they can see that, oh, actually, this can be quite helpful. I can benefit. And oh, apologies, I'm going to drop another name. I interviewed Ron Berger on Teachers Talk Radio as well, author of Ethic of Excellence. And
You're
he's
making me look bad here.
Oh no, you're way better host than I was. You're very slick and professional, and you're brilliant. And he's known for his work with peer assessment, that it should be kind, specific, and helpful. And I collaborated with him just because I totally agree with that about the kindness is key, because feedback can be personal. And if it's unkind feedback that students give one another, that could be damaging for their self-esteem and confidence and could cause conflict. So kindness is really important. To be specific, also make sure that it's helpful. But again, if the students don't act on that feedback, if they don't listen, they don't read it, they ignore it, then that's been a waste of time in the lesson. So we've also got to help them to be able to receive and recognise the importance of peer assessment. That we're not just doing it, and there's all sorts of misconceptions about self and peer assessment. I've heard students say, the teachers do this because they can't be bothered to mark our work. I'm just thinking, seriously, that's not why we do it. So with everything that we do in the classroom, we should have this conversation with the students, why we do what we do.
Yeah, I agree.
Why we don't mark every single thing in detail. Why we decided to use self-assessment here, peer assessment. When they self-assess their work, they are seeing for themselves where they've gone wrong. The problem, I've written a lot about retrieval practice, and a big problem with quizzing is just that focus on the score, the number, the grade, and that distracts from everything else. Or they might say, yeah, I got 8 out of 10 on my quiz, I'm happy with that. Well, you need to know which 2 you got wrong so that you're aware of the gaps in your knowledge, you're aware of the mistakes, and so you don't repeat those mistakes. So if they are the ones self-assessing, then they can see it right in front of them. And there's lots of ways with a quiz that you could give the feedback. It could be whole class feedback, answers on the board, you talking through, combined with the students doing their ticks and crosses. You could use peer assessment for retrieval practice, but this is a warning that retrieval practice should be low stakes. And for some students, peer assessment might slightly increase the stress level. They might not want their partner to know their score, or they might be embarrassed if they got something wrong. So self-assessment lends itself really well to the low stakes nature. And other things we've got to be very aware of is students with SEND and English as an additional language. And I've worked with lots of students, especially with English as an additional language, who I remember saying they didn't feel confident or didn't want to peer assess because the person they were peer assessing, English was their first language. So there are ways where obviously you can do that with the students, but as I've said, you might need extra resources, extra support, extra guidance. But I think they're incredibly powerful, and students should recognise the benefits of why we use those sessions.
Definitely, Kate. I mean, 2 things for me there. I'm really glad that you referenced kindness with peer assessment, because I think that's always the hesitancy, isn't it? That you've got so many kind of social dynamics happening within a classroom that it does almost seem a little bit too personal to ask somebody to read somebody else's essay or to comment on it. And I do think sometimes with teachers, there's that fear that there is going to be, somebody will just give 10 out of 10 because they want them to be friends. They want them to think positively of them. And almost too afraid to give honest feedback because they don't want to criticise. So I'm really glad that you mentioned that element of kindness. But I also think one of the other things that I'm really picking up is resonating through so much of what you're saying is this idea of not just doing feedback, but actually incorporating modelling within your feedback. Yeah. And you referenced before whole class feedback. And again, this is something I heard you speak about earlier. And I've used whole class feedback as a strategy within my classroom. I think it's really helpful in order to kind of draw on common misconceptions and, as you mentioned before, common literacy errors. But one of the things that I've taken from talking to you is this idea of it's not good enough to say to a student, you got that bit wrong, or that bit needs to be in more detail, or that bit needs to be in more depth, without actively showing them what that looks like. And it's made me really reflect on the role, or almost like the opportunity really, for model answers and for teacher modelling within feedback, which kind of brings me to another point that I just wanted to pick up with you about technology and about how teachers might have an opportunity here to utilise artificial intelligence platforms like, Pedagogy.ai, I think it is, or ChatGTP, or whatever they are, to get them to help this idea of teacher workload that we talked about earlier in generating model answers, and how that could be a really powerful tool to use as part of the feedback. Is that something that you touch on within the book?
Yes, so technology is mentioned all the way throughout, really, because obviously you can use technology inside, outside of the classroom. Basically, when I've talked about technology with retrieval practice, I say these should be your guiding principles. And I think the guiding principles with technology and feedback is that it's workload friendly. Anything, and it usually is with technology, it usually saves the teacher a significant amount of time, user friendly, so the teacher and the student can actually access that feedback, and of course it has an impact on student progress. Technology is an interesting one. There's so many quizzes out there, digital quizzes that will give this immediate feedback to students, and then it will give it to the teacher, and then you can use that information, the results, the scores, for your planning to shape your next lesson. The students can get feedback in real time if they're studying and the teacher's not there. Artificial intelligence is a really interesting one. It's one that's sort of a hot topic at the moment. And actually, there's a section in my book about AI, and it's actually from AI, and I credit it because I asked ChatGPT, how can artificial intelligence support teachers with feedback? And it listed lots and lots of different ways that it can do that. But it did say, it was really clear, it was really interesting, saying it's definitely not a replacement. It's a feedback aid. It needs to be, just as you would monitor self and peer assessment, you should keep an eye on the AI and not trust it completely. And there's also a question of ethics as well, and always being transparent with the students in terms of where that feedback is coming from. So yeah, I'm all for technology. There's so many tools, technology tools that are great for feedback. There's Teacher Fast Feedback. That's an app and a little printer that you have, and they talk into you give your verbal feedback, but then it transcribes it and prints it as a sticker. So that's if you're looking at books outside of a lesson, you can do it a lot quicker. There's also Vibble, which is audio feedback. So many benefits. And teaching in the pandemic, it was really tough, but we all just adapted so quickly, and we were given feedback using audio feedback, and so many students said that it was great to go back and revisit that feedback. You've got the teacher there, you can press replay, repeat, and the teacher doesn't actually have to do all that repetition, but and parents can listen to that feedback as well. And there's so many different ways, the benefits of audio feedback. So it's not just AI, it's quizzing. There's lots of different tools. It's worth. We need to dedicate time for training to this. I still think,
definitely.
in terms of AI, whilst obviously it's been around a long time, and Alexa and things are just a part of our life, and that we're just used to it in our day-to-day life. In terms of education, there's still quite a lot of questions, but there is a brilliant paper for those that are interested, by Dylan William, John Hattie, and Aaron Hamilton, about the role of AI in education, and feedback is one of the areas that's touched upon in that research paper.
Do you think, Kate, we are going towards a world where student essays almost get inputted into something like GPT, whichever way around it is, and they mark it in terms of, you upload a mark scheme and a level analysis, maybe even an exam feedback, an exam document, and the AI system marks the essays and then spits out individual feedback for every child? Like, do you think that's the way AI will go, or?
Well, there is already things like that. There are already websites and companies, or I worked in a school, and it was the English department that used some of their budget to send the mock exam papers off to be marked, and then they would be sent back. But they still had to look at the papers to see where the students were going wrong, to look at the individuals, to know how they could help them and guide them. So yes, absolutely, we can harness that, but it's also been shown about how mistakes can still be made, and we'd have to quality assure it and monitor it. But it really, I'm obviously, as a teacher, going to say that it cannot replace the teacher, but it can support significantly. Yeah.
Amazing. Well, Kate, I thank you so much for joining us and sharing your insights. I feel like we've learned so much tonight about effective feedback, about it being specific, actionable, focused on improvement. You've helped us with strategies to make feedback manageable. And actually, I feel like at the core of our discussion, quite rightly, was making sure that what we're doing is maximising its impact on progress while also protecting that workload for the teacher. For those listening, Kate's new book, Feedback Strategies to Support Teacher Workload and Improve Pupil Progress, is out now, and it's packed with practical ideas and fascinating case studies, some of which Kate's mentioned tonight, but I'm sure there's lots more in the book. So go away and buy it and read it and let it transform your practice. So thank you so much, Kate. Listeners, join us next week where we're going to tackle another critical topic in education. But until then, thank you, Kate. Thank you, listeners, for tuning in. And let's all keep striving to make every classroom a space for growth and for learning. And I will see you in 2 weeks.
You've been listening to Teachers Talk Radio. Tune in live and listen back at ttradio.org. We look forward to hearing from you next time on Teachers Talk Radio.